Hello, my name is Peggy Guenter, and today, on behalf of ASPEN and the celebration of our 50th anniversary, I'm honored to interview Lynne Murphy, MSN, RN, and a fellow of ASPEN. Lynne has been a longtime leader in ASPEN, and we want to have her share some of her memories of the organization. So, Lynne, thank you so much for being with us today. Can you share with us your educational background, how you got into the field of nutrition support, and your work history?
Hi, Peggy. It's so much fun to be able to talk to you again. Well, my background, it started out with a Bachelor of Science degree in nursing from Fitchburg State College in Massachusetts. And I did that not because I thought it was a bright idea to get a bachelor's degree in nursing, but I really wanted to be a journalist. So my father said to me, well, if you get a college degree and you don't like nursing, you can always move on to the next thing. And I thought, oh, that's good advice. So that was my education background. And then I went to work, as I think most of us in the early days of Aspen. I was a critical care nurse. And as a critical care nurse, I knew a lot of people through AACN, the Association of Critical Care Nurses. And it was great fun for me. And I realized that people laying in the bed all day and all week that were critically ill and we weren't feeding them. Well, I would compare that to myself. And I would say, imagine if I had to lay in bed for a week and nobody fed me, what would happen? And I thought I probably would die. So I started thinking in those terms at the time. And then we had a dietitian working in the ICU. Her name was Cheryl. And she said to me, listen, I know this great workshop in Baltimore on nutrition support. You want to go with me? I said, yeah, I'll go with you. So we went to this workshop and I learned things like mid-arm muscle circumference, hypoalbuminemia, nitrogen balance studies, and cell-mediated immunity. So when I went back to work in the ICU, I thought, why don't we do any of these things? Then I met Tim Lippman, and he said, wow, you can speak the language. Would you be interested in working for me for 6 months? I said, oh, yeah, I'll do that. You know, if you've been in the ICU for 6 or 8 years, you would do almost anything to get out of it. So anyway, that's how I met Tim, and that was in 1978. And as you know, we worked together for the rest of the time of our working lives. That's how it got started.
Yeah, and that was at the VA hospital in
That was
Washington.
yes, it was at the VA hospital in Washington, D.C. And so being in Washington, I was meeting a lot of nurses through the AACN who were like lobbyists on the Hill. So I kind of got moved over in that direction a little bit before I was even conscious of Aspen.
Yeah,
So,
great. So can you tell us a little bit about your recollections of Aspen in terms of the nursing group and the nursing nutrition support nursing community?
well, okay. When I first joined, I thought I used to hear these nurses at Aspen say, if you just do this one thing, your patients will not aspirate their tube feeding. If you just do this one thing, you'll never have an infection in TPN. And I'm thinking, wow, we must have some pretty bad nursing care here because that's not true. So that's how I got involved with Aspen because I thought I'm doing all the things they're telling me and it ain't working. So that was my intro to Aspen. And the first person who really put me to work was, remember Kathy Crocker?
Mhm.
She was the chairperson of the nurses committee, and she worked us like slaves. And so, if you remember at the time, she demanded that the nurses get equal treatment. And we had our very own workshop in Providence, Rhode Island,
I remember
at
that.
about 1980 or something.
Yeah.
And that's when I started making friends with a lot of the nurses in Aspen at the time. So it started with Kathy. And then Kathy, the way I met the nurses in Washington, the other nurses who did nutrition support, you won't believe this. It's a funny story. The Clinipad rep joined three of us together who were nutrition support nurses in DC. And that was Michelle Marr, who's deceased now, another nurse named Laura Sattler, who's I kind of lost contact with, but she was also the first nurse hired by a home care company. And then it was me. So we used to meet for Thai food every 4 weeks to exchange information. And that gave me even a better sense of nutrition support nursing.
Great, great. And you remember things, us doing things like beginning and then I know you expanded in terms of the whole nutrition support nursing community. I remember doing some of my clinical work with you when I was with Laurie Farlow at Walter Reed, getting my master's degree in the early 80s. But remember things like us beginning the nursing standards, the nursing certification. Tell some stories about those group efforts that we did.
Well, the certification effort was, were you there when we were in New York at Sally Ann
Yes,
Henry's office? Wasn't
yes,
that cool?
yeah,
Anyway, we didn't know a lot about how to do it. So we hired this woman, Sally Ann Henry, and she put us through the paces of making a certification exam. And I can still remember we had to practice things I never heard of, like the Nadelsky method. I never heard of it, but now I know what it is.
yeah,
And I remember you were there, and I and Lori and me, and I forget who else was there, but I do remember the three of us.
yes,
And I remember I mean, the interesting thing about you and I is, I mean, people may not believe this, but our lives have followed sort of the same pattern.
yeah,
You know, we went to graduate school. We married about the same time.
yeah.
You ended up having children. I did not have children. So our lives kind of followed each other over
Both
that
personally
time.
and professionally.
Yes,
Exactly,
yes.
exactly, exactly. Um, so I know a big emphasis with you and importance that you brought to Aspen were issues around public policy. So tell some stories about those. Who led some of the early efforts? Talk a little bit about Barney Sellers, and that you got your master's degree in this field, and talk about that.
Okay. Well, you're right. When Karen Kite was our original executive director, when she left, Barney Sellers came in to be the executive director, and he had government experience. So that sort of helped. But one time, you know, I'm not a shrinking violet type. So I went to see Barney one time and I said, look, let me tell you this, because I had been exposed to the nursing efforts on the Hill to pass the National Center for Nursing Research. And so people like Nancy Sharp and Mary Chafee, they sort of encouraged me and they said, well, your organization isn't doing enough to help us get this center. And you have like the perfect organization. So I went to Barney and I said, we need to do this. And he said, we don't really have, that's not what we do. I said, well, it has to be what we do. It's very important. So I'm telling him how to run the organization, right? So anyway, what happened after that was John Grant was the president of ASPEN, and he appointed Susie Curtis, who is now Susie Thomas, and another one of our colleagues that we did fun stuff with. But he appointed Susie to be chairperson of the nurses group. And also she was on the ASPEN leadership group, which was the first time a nurse was appointed there. So Susie said to me, I don't know what you said to Bonnie Sellers. And I thought she was going to say, they're going to throw you out of ASPEN. But no, what happened was she said, Barney heard what you said and he wants to start a public policy committee. Well, I nearly fainted. But anyway, I was involved with it by then. So that's how it got started, Peggy. And people like Nancy Sharp and there was I can't even remember all the people I worked with on that. And we had a real nice folder that we went on the Hill and we gave it to everybody on the Hill about the National Center for Nursing Research, which, as you know, is still a valid, well, maybe not right this minute, but it was still a valid place at the NIH. And Van Hubbard said to me, you know, that's the exact thing that ASPEN needs, because you have good nurse researchers, and that's the place they should go for their money. So that's how that got started. Can I tell you the story about the first time we went on the Hill?
Sure.
This is a long time ago. Al Bothy was chairman of the Public Policy Committee. And as it turned out, Barney was able to find out that the chairman of the Appropriations Committee for health stuff was also Al Bothy's elected representative. So he said, why don't you see if we can testify on the Hill, since he represents you in Congress, as well as being this important appropriations guy? Well, Al Bothy was scared to death. So we got a big chuckle out of it, but we all went to support him when he gave his testimony. And, you know, when you go on the Hill to give testimony, you're sitting there down on the floor, and all those people are like up on a dais. So they're like looking down on you. That's what it feels like. And then they have these little stoplights in front of you to let you know when you're almost finished and that kind of stuff. So Al Bothy gave his testimony, and we all went to the back of the room. We shook his hand and patted him on the back. And then the next person came in to do their testimony. Well, it happened to be somebody from the Ileitis Colitis Foundation named Mary Ann Mobley. Mary Ann Mobley had just been crowned Miss America about 2
Wow.
years before that. So we thought, what the heck? Nobody's going to pay attention to what Aspen said, because here's Miss America. So that was our first foray on the Hill, and that's a long time ago, because
Yeah.
Joe Moakley from Boston, he's deceased now, but I haven't heard anything from Al Bothy in a couple of years, but that's one of the stories that happened on the Hill.
Yeah, there's a famous picture that we actually put in the history wall of that testimony. It's good to hear more about that.
Well,
Um,
Miss America showed up. That kind of made a
that's
dent.
right. That's right. So tell us, Al Barocas mentioned that you had talked to him about Senator John Glenn talking about the space diet
Oh, gosh.
and all of that.
Well, it was another one of those Hill meetings, and I was meeting with different senators who were involved in nutrition stuff. And a lot of times we don't think of all of the people that would be involved with that. Some of them were Senator Bob Dole, who was with the FAAN group, but he was really incredibly interested in nutrition things because of his position there. But people don't always think about NASA as a medical research place. But NASA they've done some wonderful research studies on weightlessness. And well, anyway, I won't go into all that detail. But one of the things they had to do early on was find out what to feed astronauts, because they didn't want to have a lot of, quote, physical waste. Now, they had special things so they could pee, but poop was getting to be a problem.
Yeah.
So they said, well, maybe if we try this really elemental diet, just amino acids, and that way it'll be absorbed right away and you won't have to worry about poop anymore. So all the astronauts drank Vivanex. Well, I don't think it was called Vivanex back then.
Oh,
So I'm not going to tell you what happened after that. Everyone to a person had diarrhea so bad, and John Glenn said to me, can you imagine what diarrhea is like in a weightless environment? And I said, I don't even want to think about it. But
yeah.
that was one of the funny stories about being on the Hill.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
one of my favorites.
Yes. I remember when malnutrition was really becoming much more of a focal point for Aspen. And you and I went to a Senate briefing in 2009 on the Hill. And Gordon Jensen was speaking, and we went there, and who showed up for the talk but George McGovern. So do you know much? I mean, you know, George McGovern and Bob Dole both were very instrumental in many of the nutrition projects um, uh, and programs in the government. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, we hardly ever think about some of the people like that doing nutrition research or thinking it important. But I had a different reason for wanting to see George McGovern, besides just the fact to honor his work in nutrition. when you and I went to that meeting, that was at the Capitol, the visitor center at the Capitol, and it had just opened like either that day or the day before. What I remember is we were on our way in, and the police made me throw away my empty water bottle. And it was a fancy kind of gizmo that one of the physicians here in Florida had given me as a gift. And I said, no, that's empty. There's nothing in it. He said, I don't care, throw it away. Thought, okay, you don't have to tell me twice. So we went in. And I said to you, Peggy, look, there's George McGovern. I got to go talk to him. And again, my not being a shrinking violet, I went right up to him. And of course, he's 90 years old at the time. And I said, Senator, I just want to say one thing to you. The first time I ever voted, I voted in Massachusetts and I voted for you. And he said, well, honey, we sure showed him, didn't we? Because if you remember what happened after that, he was running against Richard Nixon, and Richard Nixon had to leave the White House. So, that's why he said that. And I just thanked him for all of the work he did in nutrition. I have a really crazy story about Barney and me and public policy. Another crazy thing happened. There was a nurse. She was from Spokane, Washington, and I can't even remember her name. Anyway, she was into stuff for geriatrics, and she called the elderly. Now, this lady was in her 80s at the time. She came to the ASPEN meetings, and I gave a talk on public policy. And I said, you should always remember that these people on the Hill, they are your employees. You pay their salary. They need to do whatever you want them to do because you pay them. So she thought about that and she thought, I got to get somebody at the ASPEN meeting in Washington who can come and talk about nutrition and the elderly. So during the meeting, Barney Sellers came to me. I was not at this particular talk that was going on. He said to me, do you know so-and-so? Meaning the nurse. I said, yeah. He said, do you know that she invited the White House, the head of the chief of the White House Office of Aging to give a talk here? I said, no, I didn't know that. He said, well, somebody should let me know when the White House is calling at our meeting because and I'm thinking, wow, what did I say? And
Wow.
anyway, that was another thing that happened. It's kind of, the other side of my life at the time was I was also involved heavily in the VA things. And we had something called the Clinical Nutrition Advisory Group, which I served on that group for must be 10 years. And so I got to hang out with a lot of the VA people on the Hill as well, with the ASPEN people. So that's kind of some of this stuff.
But I know that a lot of the VAs, because of those kinds of efforts, have nutrition support teams and have like curriculum and publications, and they're all trying to work really hard on veterans nutrition care. And I
Yep.
think that
Yep.
has a lot to do with that group. So
Yeah, a
thank
long
you for
time
that.
ago.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank
It
you for that.
started actually with the you remember the VA cooperative study? I think
Yes.
Penn was involved with that too.
Yeah. I worked at the VA at the time, and Gordon Busby and Jim Mullen were running that study and
Oh my, Gordon
the
Busby, that's the
research.
guy I couldn't think of.
Yeah, and the research group at the VA had that. So, and I was working at the VA as a nutrition support nurse. So it
And
was
I
very
was at the VA in
interesting.
Washington
Yep,
as the nutrition
yep,
support
yep,
nurse. Yeah,
yep,
the olden days.
yep.
Anyway, I thought you'd like this story about the White House Office on
Yeah,
Aging. Shows
yeah,
up at the ASPEN meeting to give a talk to it. We used to have a group that dealt just with geriatrics.
yeah.
And
Yeah,
this
we did.
woman was the chairperson of that particular group
Wow.
and invited the guy. And I thought, oh my gosh, even I don't have that much nerve.
Yeah, that was pretty impressive. So where do you see Aspen in the field of nutrition support in the future, particularly around public policy?
Well, I think Aspen is going off in a good direction. I think one of the things I remember some of the presidents of Aspen saying to me when I was on public policy, when I was the chairperson, they would say, now listen, I want to get paid for this. And I said, there's one thing I know about public policy. You do not go into a congressman's office and say, I want money, because then they're going to write you off and say, get out of here. I said, we have to figure out a way to say it without saying it. So I said to them, tell them how much time is spent on each patient that you have. Tell them the complications that can happen. So that's, I think, was a better thing. I think the whole thing about malnutrition will help us broaden our appeal. I don't think it might not be our number one thing that we should dwell on, but I think it helps with the appeal of Aspen. I know Jay Mertello and I used to talk a lot about the safety of TPN.
Yeah.
And if you don't know how to, I remember I've heard you say we used to mix it in the medicine room.
Yeah.
When I think about what we used to do, Peggy, so that part of it, the safety of it is important as well. And I think the home care issue is incredibly important. In the hospital, we have pumps, we have cleaning supplies, we have what we need. But in the home, you just never know, you know. And so when I met years ago, I talked about meeting Laura Sattler, and she was the nutrition support nurse with Ezra Steiger when he first started nutrition support. And she ended up being the first, as far as I know, the first home care nurse. So, and that's a lot more, that's 40 years ago. So
Yeah.
those days are over. But
Yeah.
I think home care and with tube feeding and TPN, those are complicated things to ask families to do, I think.
Yeah. And now with all the shortages and now with the tariffs and how the costs of all these supplies are going to go up, there's a lot more challenges with home care, with any of these therapies, but certainly with home care is
Yep. Yeah.
more vulnerable. So
There's one other thing, a story for you that I want to tell. The first ASPEN meeting I went to was in 1979. And then I went to Annette, and I think somehow that's how I met Ron Koritz. So Ron and Tim and I decided that we would go have a nice dinner somewhere. And Ron had heard about this wonderful place, you ready, in Tijuana, Mexico. So off we go to Tijuana, Mexico for this dinner. And I wrote a short story about this once called Eating Raw Eggs in Tijuana. We walk into this fancy restaurant. Well, the waiter, we're going to have Caesar salad. He breaks raw egg into the dish. He whips it up with anchovies and garlic. And I'm thinking, I'm going to eat raw eggs in Tijuana. Well, it kind of became a joke. But I'll tell you what, for 46 consecutive years, we have met for dinner at the ASPEN meeting.
yeah.
Ron, Tim, me, and over the years, different people have come in and out of our group. And John Rombo came to a couple of them. Sam Klein came to a couple of them. And after that, Sam Klein would call me and say, no, I'm going to have this for dinner. What kind of wine should I order? I mean, Sam Klein and I never talked about nutrition support, but we talked about what kind of wine went with your dinner. So that's kind of one of those, we have friendships that we made in Aspen. And I think new people coming in should know that you and I started out in the late 70s and we're still friends.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I remember one time you and Susie Curtis Thomas and Marsha Orr and I were watching a hockey playoffs. And we had a bottle of scotch. And you said, we need to write this paper about nutrition support nurses. So we looked at you and said, okay, Peggy, we'll do that. And sure enough, we all went home and we wrote this paper on nutrition support nurses. I
Yeah.
remember, I forget what year that was, but I do remember that
Yeah.
happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
It was really, I think that whole thing about people you meet and friendships you have all over the country are just, and all over the world are just, it's a really special thing about Aspen. I'm not sure that happens in other organizations, but it brings us back each year. And when I went back this time for the 50th anniversary, it was just so nice to see everybody. And so I thank you for your friendship and your collegiality and your education for me. And your guidance in public policy when I started working in Aspen and became the Senior Director for Clinical Practice, Quality, and Advocacy, which I knew
Yeah.
nothing about. I turned first to you, and you helped me out with a lot of that stuff and learned on the job, and you dragged me up the hill and everything else. So I
Oh, the end of
appreciate it.
that on the hill story, if you remember this, we finally left the meeting. We were sitting outside. It was a beautiful spring day, but there were like hundreds of helicopters that was in the
Right.
sky. And
Yeah.
what we found out later was there was a shooting at the Holocaust Museum. And
Right.
that's why
Right.
that policeman made me throw my water bottle away.
Yeah.
Never forgave him, but I mean, he had good reason to do what he did.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
I think what I remember is we went in and everything was calm. And when we left, it looked like all of Washington got turned upside down and
Yes.
all kinds of stuff. So we got out of there quick.
Yeah, that
But
was something
anyway,
else. Yeah.
yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this with us. Thanks for the great stories and the insight into both Aspen nursing and into public policy. And thanks so much, Lynn. Appreciate
Peggy,
it.
it was great fun. I enjoyed every minute. Thanks a lot for
Yeah.
the memories.
Okay. All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.